Hey guys, this is Josh for the Adept Ape channel, and in this video we're going to be talking about troubleshooting diesel engine problems that don't have a check engine light, but there's no check engine light associated with. Now, I'm going to be focusing on cats in this video because that's my area of expertise, but the troubleshooting guide I'm going to be talking about can really apply to any diesel engine. And for the most part, any diesel engine built in the last 20-25 years is going to have a lot of sensors, and it's going to have an electronic control module. And I'll hear a lot of times, hey, I have an engine miss, but it's not an injector because my injector's not coding. Or, hey, my engine's doing such and such, and there's no code. What could it possibly be? Well, it could be a lot of things. So the sensors are there to tell the ECM, obviously, the timing of the engine, pressures, and temperatures for the most part. Now, that doesn't mean that if a sensor isn't faulting, that it's not the sensor or the wiring to the sensor in itself, because a sensor, if it doesn't short or open, the ECM doesn't know it's necessarily bad. So let's say, for example, a coolant temp sensor. It might be shorted, which would be short, an electrical short, or it could be open, which would mean it's electrically not making contact. This would cause a check engine light because the ECM uses a pull-up voltage, and it'll say, hey, we have an open circuit or a shorted circuit in this particular area. Let's go look at that. But let's say the coolant temp sensor is stuck at 32 degrees. Is it going to throw a check engine light? Most of the time, it's not going to throw a check engine light because the ECM thinks that the sensor is reading accurately. So that's one thing to understand. You might have a sensor fault, but it's not throwing a code. So that's one thing to understand. Also, injectors. Injectors don't code if they're misfiring typically. And this is something to understand. Injectors can code because the ECM controls the current if it's an electronic unit injector. And if the solenoid fails, the ECM is going to know because it's either going to pull more or less current than it should be pulling, so it'll throw a code. But if there's something mechanically wrong with the injector, let's say something internal is seized or mechanically the spring's broken, something like that, the ECM will not know that because the ECM only monitors the electronic side, or I should say the electrical side. It's not monitoring it mechanically. So if you have an engine miss and there's no code, it could be an injector. It's not necessarily going to code, okay? Now, I could go step by step over 10 million different things that could be causing one particular subject, but I really want to go over how I troubleshoot something when it comes in, and I'll give a few examples of how I would go about it, okay? So instead of just making up examples, I'll use some actual email examples that I've gotten recently, and we'll try to dissect them and what my thought processes is for how I would troubleshoot this particular issue. So I had a gentleman email me and say, hey, I have a C13, and when it's in colder temperatures, basically the engine coolant temperature is less than 150 degrees, it is stuttering, it's stumbling, and it's throwing a lot of white smoke. No check engine light. Now, the first thing I tell anyone troubleshooting any sort of performance issue is to always check fuel pressure. And cracking the line does not mean you checked fuel pressure. That might mean there's fuel present, but that does not mean it has adequate fuel pressure. If you crack the line and it has 2 psi, it's going to spray out. If you crack the line and it has 100 psi, it's going to spray out. I had someone comment once and said, it's kind of like a doctor, instead of taking your blood pressure, just cuts your arm open and says, well, blood's coming out, your blood pressure must be okay. It's kind of similar to that. The fuel pressure is very important on a diesel engine since your injectors do everything. There's no spark, it's all injectors, and fuel pressure fluctuations can cause problems in that system. So the person that emailed me had said, okay, well, I checked fuel pressure. And that's good. That's great, actually. Most people never check it. But there's a difference between checking fuel pressure at idle, stationary, and actually checking it under the condition where it's failing or where it's missing. So if you're going to check fuel pressure and you're having a particular issue, try to rig a fuel pressure gauge and put it on the windshield wiper inside the cab. And if it's something, let's say it does it for the first 5 minutes of running, replicate the condition with the fuel pressure gauge. We had an RV recently in the shop, and fuel pressure was fine if you rev it up in the shop or just idling. Get it on the road, it would just drop down to 0. Now, if we had not tested that on the road, we would not have known that. So if you have a fuel pressure gauge and you can test it, make sure you test it under the condition that you're trying to troubleshoot. It might be fuel related, and you thought you already checked it off the box because you check fuel pressure at idle. So that's very important to check that. And most cats don't have fuel pressure gauges electronically installed, so you pretty much always, except for a few C7s, have to install a manual fuel pressure gauge. Now, for the sake of this video, we're going to assume that he did check fuel pressure under the loaded condition, that it was doing it, and fuel pressure was fine. We'll say it was at 80 psi. Okay, well, that pretty much isolates the fuel system as having enough pressure. Now, that doesn't mean that there's maybe not some air in the fuel. It doesn't mean maybe there's too heavy of a pull on the inlet side of the fuel transfer pump, but usually if you have a suction side problem, you're going to have a pressure side problem. So we'll say fuel pressure is good. Now, this particular issue is cold related, or at least the coolant temp sensor seems to affect it. Now, no check engine light. That's why I put it in this video. And so what would I check next? Well, that's where I would go into on ET, and that's another problem is if you have a sensor that's faulting out and you don't have a gauge for it, it's really hard to tell. Let's say his intake air temperature sensor is reading 10 degrees Fahrenheit for some reason. It reads it all the time. Almost no dash has a air temp gauge, at least what the ECM's reading, but the ECM can see that. And it's very important because your coolant temp and your intake air temp and your fuel temp determines the amount of fuel that the ECM is going to allow the injectors to fire with. Now, if that's the sensor's not shorted or opened, but it's just reading inaccurately, and you don't have a way to communicate with that ECM, that it might just be a sensor problem or maybe a wiring problem on the ECM to the sensor. You would never know unless you plug into it with CAT ET and see what the ECM is seeing. There are many times I've seen this where it's just the sensor's not reading accurately, and that'll throw it off. Remember, the sensors are there to tell the ECM what to do and how much fuel to give your injectors. So that's very important to do. Now, most people don't have access to CAT ET, and it's quite expensive to get it. CAT will sell you it on an annual subscription from your CAT dealer, and the prices vary from dealer to dealer, so I'm not going to quote the price, but it's several $100s minimum from most dealers, so, and that's per year. So most people aren't going to get that if they just own, let's say, a single engine. So if you can't have access to the status screen and see what the sensors are reading, what else could you do? Well, there's a feature that CAT has if you have a cruise control switch called a snapshot, and you can actually take snapshots yourself. You do not need CAT ET to take them. You do need CAT ET to read them, but if you have something that, let's say, only happens once a day or something, you could take a snapshot, and I'll show you how to take a snapshot right here. So this is how a snapshot works. The ECM can record a snapshot of the engine parameters and vehicle parameters. The snapshot records the parameters for a period of 13 seconds, 9 seconds before the trigger, and 4 seconds after the trigger. A technician can use ET in order to view the snapshot. So these are the instructions. Basically, you're going to toggle your set resume switch very quickly. And under a second, you're going to go from set to resume and then back to off. That's all you have to do. Or you can do it in reverse order, and it'll save it in the ECM for 100 hours. So that's how you take a snapshot, and a technician or someone with ET would be able to open that snapshot, and it'll save up to 4 of them, and you could view it later. And this would verify if you have a sensor that is malfunctioning, something like that. So that's something good to know. Now, this next subject that I tell people to check, and I've already made a video on, is the engine timing sensors. Pretty much all CAT electronic engines have 2. They have a primary and secondary engine timing sensor. Now, if they're in conflict, meaning one's not reading the same as the other and it's running, usually the engine will throw a check engine light for this, but many times I've seen that it hasn't. Usually those are not temperature dependent faults. Usually those will be an intermittent hiccup, maybe under acceleration at a certain vibration or RPM, or maybe the engine won't start unless you use ether, or it'll intermittently just not start. I've seen this a few times. We had a truck towed into us because it wouldn't start unless you used ether, and they'd put a new harness on it. They'd checked all sorts of stuff. I believe they'd put a new ECM on it, and it ended up being the primary timing sensor reading the crank position was just not reading. I ohmed it out, and it was open. It was an open circuit. Put a new sensor on it, fired right up. We had a truck in our shop once that I had worked on it a little bit, but then it got put in another mechanic's hands, and it would intermittently not start. It wouldn't start with ether, no check engine lights. We verified HUE pressure, we verified fuel pressure, all this stuff, and ended up being the timing sensors were bad. The wiring was shorted, and if you're really interested in this, you should watch the video on it because I discussed it in more detail, but the timing sensors can screw with you because the engine has nothing to reference them other than themselves. So if it just sees no timing signal, it doesn't necessarily know that the timing sensors or the wiring to them is bad. It just knows, hey, I'm not getting a signal, and it might intermittently cause a miss. It could cause it to intermittently not start. It can cause other issues. So that's one other thing to check. Now, this particular subject, it's temperature related. So it does it, he's saying about before it's 150 degrees engine coolant temperature. So probably less than 10 minutes of runtime. So that's good to know because it could also be fuel viscosity related. It could be oil viscosity related. Or what else expands and contracts with temperature? Well, everything does, but your electrical contacts. So the engine ECM on cats are fairly robust. They don't fail all the time, but they do fail sometimes. And they're particularly bad about telling you if they're having an issue unless they just out and out short where they lose communication or where they're throwing all the injector solenoid faults. If you see all the injector solenoid faults shorting open and closed at the same time, that usually indicates a bad ECM. But in that case, usually the truck doesn't start and you'll have check engine lights. Now, I have seen a few ECMs cause weird issues that are temperature related. I had a C7 once, no check engine light, fuel pressure was good. We had it on the dyno, and after about 25 minutes of running, it would just lose horsepower. It would go from, I think it was a 300 horsepower. It would just drop down to 125 horsepower. No codes, no D-rate, nothing. And I put a test ECM on it, and it fixed it. Kind of weird. It didn't throw codes. It's just sometimes those ECMs will fault. Now, unfortunately, the ECM is extremely expensive. We're talking usually about $2,000 plus for actual CAD ECM. So the last thing you want to do is just throw an ECM on it. But that is one thing to keep in mind is it could potentially be the ECM and it's not throwing a check engine light. Now, let's assume that all the sensors are reading correctly and we do not have a bad ECM. Well, then it's going to be either we'll say fluid related or mechanically related. Now, it would be weird, and I would say very rare for it to have an actual mechanical fault that's causing a intermittent condition. Usually, if you have a bad camshaft or spun bearing, something weird like that, a cracked head, usually those get worse as it heats up. It's not something that just goes away at a certain temperature. Okay, so since it's temperature related, and he's also saying it throws white smoke as it's stumbling, what other symptoms are there? Is this the only symptom? If it was, let's say, burning coolant only when cold, that usually will not cause a stumble. Let's say he has a weird crack in the head and it's causing this stumble and the white exhaust smoke. You would have other symptoms then. It would be eating coolant, so your coolant level would be decreasing. Or let's say, I don't know how this would be possible, but it's only burning oil when cold and doesn't burn any when it's hot. I don't see how that would be causing a engine stumble, but you would be burning more oil, so your oil level would be decreasing more rapidly than it usually would. Since it's white exhaust smoke, and we're going to assume it's not eating oil or coolant, it's probably fuel related. So we have a condition where we have theoretically, we've eliminated the fuel system as far as pressure. We've eliminated the electronics and the sensors. Our coolant and oil are not decreasing in this theoretical situation. So we know we're burning excess fuel and it's stumbling in colder conditions, and we don't suspect the ECM's causing the misfire. So what does that really leave us with? Well, that leaves us with injectors. Now, the injectors are fuel, mechanical, and electrical. Now, if the solenoid fails, the ECM will code right away. But that's not the case in this situation. So we probably have a malfunctioning or multiple malfunctioning injectors in this situation. Now, a set of injectors is very expensive. You're talking probably about $3,000 to replace them all. So I would probably ask the customer how many miles are on this engine. Have the injectors ever been replaced? Has an overhead ever been done? Now, usually if the overhead's off a little bit, it's not going to cause any situation like this. But let's say these are original injectors. It's got 1 million miles. The head's never been off. You might want to look at getting a new set of injectors at this point. If you just want to try and isolate that single injector, you would probably have to do a road test or a dyno pull with it in the condition, so 150 degrees, and you would have to just go through and individually cut out one injector at a time and see if the smoke goes away or the stumble. Well, the stumble wouldn't go away because the cylinder would be dead anyways, but if the smoke goes away at one injector, or let's say multiple injectors, if you can isolate them, you know it's in the injectors then. And the injectors are the most complex things on this engine. Since they fired rapidly, they rely on very high pressure, and they're very complex internally. They do wear over time. And my guess is that this customer may have an injector issue if he had followed the rest of the troubleshooting tree. Well, that was a long one, huh? That would have been one email, and I get about 20 of those a day. Of course, some of them are simple. Some of them I can't really help them with if they're in another country and they're working on a Cummins-powered drill rig or something. But so about another instance with no check engine light, but engine wouldn't start or some other condition. So this was an RV. They had some work done on it, and the engine would then not start. It wasn't related to what the work was done. I believe it had a service done to it. So did a warranty download, inspected it, cranked it. It was building some HUE pressure, but it was not building very much HUE pressure. The HUE pump was going to max output, but it wasn't building very much. So the customer had someone else work on it, and they pulled the valve cover and inspected that none of the injectors were leaking the HUE pressure out of any of the O-rings or out of the injectors. So they determined, okay, we don't have a leak, and perhaps it's the HUE pump itself. Now, they also checked the timing sensors, and it turned out one of the timing sensors was bad. Put new timing sensors on it, didn't fix it. So the person working on it had called me for kind of a consult to say, hey, looks like it could be the HUE pump here. And I said, sounds like it probably could be. Probably just check the injection actuation pressure sensor to verify that it's not just the sensor that is faulting before you change the pump. And they said they did, but apparently they didn't, because they ended up changing the HUE pump and the problem remained the same. Now, they already knew that they didn't have an injector leak, and it was only building a few hundred psi of HUE pressure. Turns out the injection actuation pressure sensor was not working correctly. It, for whatever reason, wouldn't go past a couple hundred psi, even though the rail pressure was high enough. Now, that's a particular issue because temperature sensors can be independently verified, or I should say they can be verified easily, because if you check your coolant temp sensor and your intake air temperature sensor and your fuel temperature sensor, and the truck's been off several hours and the ambient temperature is 50 degrees and they're all showing 50 degrees, looks like the sensors are working accurately. Not only that, if it's 100 degrees outside and your coolant temp sensor is saying it's 32 degrees, you know you have a problem with the coolant temp sensor circuit. So pressure sensors need to be independently verified. Now, if this is a rail pressure sensor, a barometric pressure sensor, or a HUE pressure sensor, if you're having a problem with that system, that's always one of the things CAT wants you to do. Put a manual gauge on it. The sensors usually read accurately, but if you have a problem with that system, you need to independently verify it. A simple 10-minute check of the rail pressure on this would have eliminated the whole problem of needing the Huey pump, which it probably didn't need in the first place. Now, that's unfortunate, but it's kind of a lesson to show that you need to independently verify sensors if you have a problem with a system. So that's one other thing to check. Now, this will be my last example, and of course, I could go over thousands of examples that I've seen, worked on myself, or seen other people work on over the years. And some of them are tricky, and some of it has to come down to knowledge of the particular engine you are working on. Now, one of the advantages and disadvantages of my particular field is that I pretty much worked exclusively on Cat diesel engines for about a decade, and that has not made me a well-rounded mechanic as far as I'm not very good with Cummins, I'm not very good with Detroits, I'm not great for chassis work, although I can do it. I'm best suited for Cat engines, which enables me to help other mechanics that are more well-rounded. Now, in this particular instance, we had a C7S, which is a regen C7 with a common rail system. This customer had a turbo failure, or what looked like a turbo failure. The turbocharger was pushing oil out of the compressor side, the intake side. And they had inspected the shaft. It looked like the shaft seals had failed or the bearing had failed because there was a lot of shaft end play. So they replaced the turbocharger. Probably anyone would have done the same. They then put new turbocharger on. This is a variable geometry turbo, very expensive, about $3,000, and not the easiest to get on and off. And they start it up. Looks good. It's not leaking right away. Run it for about 15 minutes. And oil is coming out of the compressor side again. They check the end play on the shaft. This time, the end play's fine. So we have what seems to be a good turbo, but it's pushing oil. What would cause that? Maybe it's a bad shaft seal. Unfortunately, this particular situation, the customer was not super knowledgeable on this engine. The C7Ss have a closed crankcase pressure system, which means the crankcase fumes don't vent to atmosphere. They vent to the exhaust. So that means any exhaust restriction or restriction in the crankcase breather system will cause excess crankcase pressure, and the first place that usually becomes manifest is the turbocharger. So I went out, hooked up to it, and fired it up, and guess what? He had, at idle, cold, started up, he had over 1 psi of crankcase pressure, which 1 psi doesn't sound like a lot. That's a lot of crankcase pressure. There really shouldn't be any crankcase pressure, especially 1 psi at idle. Usually you'll see 0.1 psi at idle, and that's because the fumes have to go through the DPF, and there's about a 1 psi differential pressure on the DPF. I informed the customer that it's probably a plugged fitting in the crankcase breather, and the customer found that it was, and they fixed it. No more leak on the turbocharger. So if you are working on a particular issue, I would say try to research the exact engine you're working on and learn as much about it, because many times certain engines have common failures that all engines don't necessarily have. That particular model may have a certain quirk that causes it to do certain things, so that's good to know. Now, I hope you enjoy this video, and if you're having an issue, think about what I talked about. Try to think out the problems, how I would think about the problems, if you can. Now, I know you've been asking for a certain subject that's been missing recently. Time for some destruction of the week. So what you're looking at here is a C15, and you're looking at the deck between the block and the head, and if you look real closely, you can actually see oil is bubbling out of there. So that one obviously needs resealed. Pretty major job. So we got a C10 here, came in for light miss, and this is what the camshaft looked like. Rollers, this was actually on a different cylinder. Almost every single cam lobe, and not every cam lobe, but every cylinder had a bad cam lobe, whether it was the intake or the exhaust. You can see more of the different cam journal here. This was a car hauler with a weird whine, and they had lost their carrier bearing, and look at the teeth on this ring gear here. This is out of the differential. Obviously needs repaired. Thanks for watching the video.